So my name is Ruud Wouters. I'm from the University of Antwerp, and together with Stefaan, I wrote this paper. The title of the paper is Making the Implicit Scorecard Explicit, Television News Coverage of Protest and the WUNCness of Collective Action. Now, probably for many of you who first read this title, you were thinking probably something like this. What the WUNC are these guys talking about? What is WUNCness? So, and that's a very good question, because basically that's where this paper is all about. So in the first part of this paper, we will explain WUNC. What is it? We will integrate Tilly's take on the subject and embed it in the broader social movement literature. And then in the second part of the paper, we make WUNC operational and test its presence in television news. So we will try to answer 3 research questions. To what extent is media coverage of protest WUNC? How do the different WUNC components relate? Because WUNC is an acronym, but I will only tell this at slide number 4, what the letters of the acronym mean. And I will also, the third research question is, are there any differences across movements, stations, and protest forms in terms of WUNC? So, but first, what is WUNC? Well, it has nothing to do with science fiction, nor is it a term of Klingon vocabulary. No, it has everything to do with this person in the right-hand corner, which is Charles Tilly, a very famous social movement scholar. So, WUNC is a term coined by Charles Tilly. It appears scattered across his work, and according to our lit review, it appeared first in 1994 in an article. According to Tilly, WUNC is a definitional element of a social movement. He defines a social movement as a sustained, organized claim-making effort, which he labels a campaign. And that campaign it consists of a combination of performances, which is a repertoire, and this repertoire displays WUNC. But more important for this workshop and also for our take on the concept is that Tilly considers WUNC as a scorecard against which observers measure the power of protest. So in a simple formula, WUNC equals impact. The more WUNC a demonstration, the more persuasive the demonstration is. So what is WUNC? Well, WUNC is an acronym, and it stands for WUNCness, unity, numbers, and commitment. What Tilly writes about it is basically illustrative and anecdotal. So he says things like worthiness in a demonstration means, for instance, sober demeanor or neat clothing. Unity is matching badges, banners, marching in ranks. Numbers is head counts, and commitment, for instance, is braving bad weather or resistance to repression. So basically, WUNC communicates an identity claim of a group. It says we are many, we agree among ourselves, we are committed and we will persist, and we are worthy, disciplined, and legal. And this group identity claim backs up program claim, backs up the issue claims of the movement. So, in our words, WUNC actually is a little bit of social movement PR. It's the ultimate scope enlargement mechanism for social movements. It turns neutral observers into sympathizers. And to say that WUNC is rather important, often discussion on demonstrations centers on one of these components when people discuss protest. Tilly also wrote theory about WUNC mechanisms, and they all have names. For instance, Tilly says movements try to maximize their WUNCness, the maximization mechanism. Its movements strive to maximize their value on each component. The second mechanism is compensation. A high value on one component can compensate for a low value on another. For instance, if people are very few, if they are very committed, they can make an impact, for instance. For instance, a hunger strike often is done by very few people, but they are so committed that they can make a strong impression. Third mechanism is nullification or disqualification. That means that if any of the values of the components falls to 0, the movement misfires. If you're extremely unworthy, you will have no impact. And then finally, that's an important mechanism, that's the mystification mechanism, and that is that the components of the WUNC concept, they contradict each other. For instance, an increase in numbers probably brings less committed people to the street, or brings people with different takes on the same subject to the street. So the unity decreases. Then also the components work ambivalently. For instance, especially for the unity component, it is conditional whether homogeneity, which means unity, or heterogeneity works. And that's why we will add a fifth component to this WUNC concept and speak of WUNC with a small d, and the small d stands for diversity. And then the ultimate mystification mechanism actually is that a WUNC identity presents an image of an integrated group with a history, but social movements, as we all know, actually are flexible, networked structures that often go in abeyance structures, and so on. So that's WUNC. What were our objectives in this paper? Well, we had two objectives, theoretical and empirical. The theoretical objective was to integrate WUNC, and that's what I've done now in the last few slides. And another objective, theoretical objective, was to embed each component in broader social movement literature, because, as you all noticed probably, WUNC sounds odd, WUNC sounds even more odd, but actually all these components can be related to very important or classic work in social movements literature. For instance, we can link WUNCness to the paradigm shift from collective behavior to resource mobilization theory. Unity clearly relates to frame alignment theory. So in our paper we try to embed each component in classic work of social movements. Second objective, besides the theoretical objective of our paper, was an empirical objective, and was our light in putting WUNC to the test. And we constructed the argument that most of the interaction between movements, elites, and the general public occurs in the media, in the mass media arena, and therefore we thought, well, probably social movements want to broadcast their WUNCness in the media arena, and therefore we did a content analysis of media coverage of protest, addressing the three research questions I presented on the second slide. So, our data collection. What was our data? We started from police archive data in the city of Brussels, which is the capital of Belgium and also of Europe. And then we looked which events of these police archive data set made it into the news. It were about 544 newscasts or news reports. It's the 7 o'clock newscast of the public and commercial station of the Belgian television. And we had two coding procedures. One normal procedure with explicit coding. So that was were three coders. I did 51% of all the coding, and we did it very strict. So it was an explicit coding, and intercoder or iterator reliability scores were calculated, and they were fine. A second coding procedure was we organized something like an implicit panel coding, a panel vote. So we had 5 coders, and all these 5 coders had to code all clips, all 544 or 564, I don't remember exactly, and they had to score each WUNC component on a 5-point scale: unworthy, worthy, large, small scale, large scale. And this allowed us to construct a total WUNC score, which was an implicit panel vote. And as we expected, because WUNCness is sometimes hard to measure or to perceive, the reliability scores of these implicit codings were dramatic. But only for numbers they were good. So the results, I will present them very briefly. I will give an example of the top WUNC demonstration in our dataset. Then I will briefly summarize the results on each WUNC component, and then I will say something about the relationship between the components. So this is the top 2 table of all demonstrations of the most WUNC demonstrations. So here is a score on 125. So each coder or each component had a score of 25, because there were 5 coders and each could give a value from 1 to 5. And so the most WUNC demonstration is actually on a valence issue. It's a Mars a march against random violence organized after there was an accident of random violence. We had Jovan Holsbeek, who was a youngster. He was standing in the central station in Brussels, the train station, and he wouldn't give his MP3 player to other youngsters, and he was stabbed for it. And the event was caught on security cameras, and it became a big media event. And the parents of Joe, a couple of weeks after the incident, they made a call: we want to organize a demonstration. And on very short notice, a demonstration was organized, and this is the WUNC score of the report on the public broadcaster. So what did the public broadcaster set? In terms of crowd composition, they said the friends of Joe, who organized the march with the parents, they were walking up front, old people, famous people, normal people, politicians, a diverse group of people participated. Worthiness was explicitly mentioned by the journalist. The journalist said something in Dutch like, het was een zeer waardige optocht. Unity, they said, they were all together there for the same claim. They were moments, and it was very emotional because it was filmed, of collective silence, a mass that was silent together. Or there were moments of collective applause. The numbers, the journalist said they were 80,000, which was many more people, or much more people than expected, because it was such a grassroots event, and it was so organized very at the last moment. Commitment was not explicitly mentioned, and you see that the coders coded very, or the lowest on commitment. So it had a full number score, but commitment was rather low. And probably the explanation for this is, well, it was a valence issue, and the motives of the demonstrations of the demonstrators often are expressive. Then, so they don't really have a policy goal. They wanna, so it isn't like something that is likely to build up to a kind of sustained activism. So commitment, of course, the people were commitment, but it was not like a sort of persistent activism. It was a catharsis demonstration, you could say. So that's just to give an example about how journalists narrate WUNC in the media. This is a slide about descriptives. For instance, diversity of is the crowd composition, and we noticed that only in 30% of the news items there was an explicit reference to diversity, and diversity was foremost expressed as diversity, not homogeneity. And we found out that new social movements, being environmental movements and North-South organizations, they score higher on diversity than other types of organizations. And the argument or the reason behind this is that new social movements, probably they do not have the numerical strength. They have only a small membership base. They need to show their diversity, that they convinced other social movement industries to participate, to show their power. Worthiness, non-violence, was very rarely explicitly mentioned, and we probably think that this has to do with journalistic norms of neutral reporting. If a journalist says, well, they are so worthy, then, well, is he still objective, or is he an advocate for the demonstrators? Unworthiness is a prominence mechanism. It means that if demonstrators behave unworthy, they more easily make the headlines, get longer news items, and so on. So these were some of the findings. Unity was also rarely explicitly mentioned, but was overall at an overall high score. And what's probably more important is that Unity was very prominent in visuals. Alright, so these are simple descriptives of the components. Now I will very shortly address the relations between the components, and I think that the most important thing is the numbers fact. So these are simple Pearson correlations of numbers with the total WUNC score, and it's a very high correlation. And we think that numbers set the threshold for activists to come across as dwunk in the media arena. If you mobilize in high numbers, then many people will show up, and journalists will start to wonder about the diversity of the march, the unity of the march, the commitment of the demonstrators. So, conclusions. I started this presentation with the question, what the WUNC? I think we have convinced you, or I hope that we have convinced you that it's totally okay to be a WUNCer. Journalists discuss WUNC. So we show that demonstrating is a numbers game, diversity and commitment are regularly explicitly mentioned, unity and worthiness more rarely. This has to do with norms of journalistic profession. Mechanisms, dwunk is related to action form, strikes are show more commitment, vigils show more worthiness, is related to movement types, diversity is a new social movement thing, numbers is an old social movement thing. Dwunk is also a selection mechanism. The higher dwunk, the more prominent demonstrations are in the news, and dwunk clusters in news reports with number as a gate opener or critical threshold. Future research, well, we would like to put dwunk to the ultimate test, and that is doing experiments and expose people to manipulated media coverage of protest actions and see whether dwunk affects protest evaluation. That would be the ultimate dwunk test. I thank you for your attention.